Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. In this episode, I'm very happy to bring the conversation I had with Alexandre Lefebvre. Alexandre is a professor of politics and philosophy at the University of Sydney. He's a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. And much of his teaching and research are in political theory, history of political thought, modern and contemporary French philosophy, and human rights. And he is the author of the latest book, Liberalism as a Way of Life. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. We start by talking about how we can extract or we can get morals and values from liberalism itself. We have sort of towards the beginning of the conversation, I wouldn't say a debate, but it kind of starts out a little spicy, and then we realize we're saying the same thing in different ways. But this notion that Christianity is behind all the things of the West and Western society and liberalism, and it was a really fun part of the conversation there, kind of towards the beginning. So I really enjoyed that part. We, of course, define liberalism, which is kind of harder than maybe some people think it is, because it's just thrown everywhere. It's used in different ways. We talk about the different types of liberalism. We talk about the differences between liberalism and conservatism and a few other big political constructs. We talk a lot about the philosophy of Rawls, which is throughout his book a lot. We have some fun bits of the conversation on swearing. We talk about fairness, spiritual exercises, public dialogue, and liberalism as a way of life, and many other topics. This was a fun one. I really enjoyed this conversation with Alex. It was very conversational. We got on well together straight from the beginning, and we're very aligned on much of this, on liberalism and so many of the topics. And it was cool, right? Because one sense when you agree with somebody, it's kind of like, yeah, me too, or I think that same way, and that doesn't happen here in some sense. Even though we do agree on most of the things we discuss, we're able to have like a very nice kind of back and forth. We can play devil's advocate. He does, I do, and really just have some fun with it. And it's pretty casual, pretty laid back in a lot of ways. And I think, honestly, that makes the best kind of conversation, because you're talking about things like liberalism, or you're talking about kind of moral philosophy, and to kind of keep it a bit loose and casual is nice, instead of just kind of talking only about theory and all the philosophical components. So we try to, I think, make it through the conversation accessible and give people something to think about. And of course, his book is just superb. Highly recommend people getting the book, which is out everywhere. And it's very readable and gives you lots and lots to think about. So if you like the conversation, definitely go get his book. It's one of the best this year. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. So get over there, subscribe, it's free. Get the email on there, and you can obviously continue the conversation, giving your thoughts in the comments and messaging and all the rest. I'm also on YouTube as well. You can subscribe there and like and share with your friends and contribute. All that is much appreciated. And now I bring you Alexandre Lefebvre. I am here with Alexandre Lefebvre. Alex, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm very excited to talk with you about your wonderful book.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So you have really written a gem of a book. So much in here. I really, really, really loved it. It's obviously very readable, very digestible, but it really does have a lot of wisdom. I feel like this is a topic that people write about, maybe in academic circles or maybe in like an op-ed or something like that. But this was practical. It was relevant, but also extremely thoughtful and fresh. So it was very, very, very good. The book is called Liberalism. Liberalism as a Way of Life. This is out through the wonderful Princeton University Press. Interestingly, no subtitle. Can you tell me a little bit why there's no subtitle? I'm
Keep it
so
clean.
used to books with subtitles, and then when I see one that doesn't, it like stands out to me.
The first key of a liberal way of life is non-wordiness. So I'm
Uh-huh.
gonna lean into
Uh-huh.
just that.
There you go. Great, great, great. And yeah, it's really, really good. So we're gonna get all into it. Before we do, just tell listeners who you are professionally, academically, and what you're currently doing.
Sure. So my name is Alex Lefebvre, and I'm a professor of politics and philosophy at the University of Sydney in Australia. If you have an ear for accents, you'll tell that I am not from around these parts. I'm Canadian. I grew up in Vancouver, and I did my education in the US. And then I came to Australia for a job 15 years ago and haven't left. It's a beautiful place to live, and that's where this finds me. And I mentioned some of that stuff because it's just biography, but also because a lot of the book is about the United States and wading into a bunch of the debates. But I'm really kind of a, let's say, an impartial onlooker to the scene. So I have some skin in the game, but I'm really a spectator from Canada on the one hand, where the U.S. has loomed so large, and then from Australia on the other hand.
Yeah, I was going to say you're a Canadian in Australia writing about U.S. Kind of is very, very interesting. We'll go with North American. How about that? We'll go with North
I
American.
can
There
live
you
with that.
go. We'll include Canada with you guys. You can come and be a part of our big family down here in the U.S. So yeah, so I guess with liberalism, right, in how you're how you're trying to look at it and stuff. I'm sure we'll define it in a bit, but I guess the first question I wanted to ask was, you talk about ways of life, you talk about values. This is a big question, right? But for you, many people will say, or maybe they won't. They'll just kind of act as if. But values will come from all sorts of places. They'll come from our histories. They'll come from our culture, maybe how we're raised. Definitely from religion. At least people think so, or they say so.
Mm.
But for you, where do you feel our values come from? I mean, they can come from those places, but could they come from, other places that aren't included in that list? And, how do we look at uh, values for secular people or for humanists, for people that are non-religious? How do you see the importance of values and where it comes from a non-religious stance?
So that's a great question. It's also kind of the first question of my book, because I think we live in this weird cultural moment. And by that, I mean, if you just rock up to someone on the street and you ask a weird question, I admit, but where do you get your values from? And by values, I mean like your moral commitments, but also kind of like just more generally your moral sense of your sensibility, like what my 15-year-old kid would call your vibe, like what makes kind of
Hmm.
you and the way you flow, the way you flow. And you ask someone that point blank, and why I say we're in a weird moment right now is people who are religious, I think, can answer that question as easily as they can answer their name. It would be like, oh, my church, or oh, my Bible, or oh, my faith, or something like that. They would be able, like, there's a there. They could like bang, point to that thing, and it's no fuss, no muss, easy question. But for us, I speak for myself. If I can go in with an intimate question early, are you yourself a secular?
Yes, I am. Yes, I
Yeah.
was. I was historically, for a long time, a fundamentalist Christian, and then I had a 3-year exodus from theist to atheist. So
Okay,
I've
right.
been
It's, when
I've
they
been
fall, they fall hard.
that's right. I became that. That started it when I was in seminary, of all
Yeah, okay,
places.
right.
So,
Okay, interesting.
but yeah, secular humanist is usually how I do it. I mean, atheist is fine, but secular humanist is definitely how I do
Yeah,
define
okay.
myself.
Cool. So we are of, forgive the phrase, we are of a cloth. You and I. Yeah. So anyway, okay. So you ask a secular that question, and I think most often, I think they're put together and they have like a value system and everything. That's not the issue. It's that they don't have like a liquid, ready to hand answer that they just go like, oh, my church. So they'll
Hmm.
struggle. And I've pestered a bunch of my friends, students, colleagues with this question, just kind of like armchair anthropology. And the answer, they always the default answer is something extremely local, like my experience, my friends and families, my upbringing, or like something really big, or like human nature. And all that stuff is fine. I don't mean to discount any of that, but all that stuff takes place and is shaped within moral, cultural, spiritual traditions. I mean, the Christian too has experiences, but the Christian on top of that has, Christianity. So the issue is that they don't know what to point to, but there's something there. And so I'm not giving away much of the game because it's in the title of my book. My sense is that those people, the unchurched, by and large, should be pointing to liberalism as the thing that makes them in a really profound sense. And so that's the move I want to make in my book. Is I want to say, so typically liberalism is thought of as this political ideology, something to do with law, constitution, stuff like that. And that's fine. I don't disagree with that, of course. But I want to say that it's gone kind of viral in the bloodstream of our culture today. So that the ideals and the principles and just the sensibility that you find in liberalism has taken off and starts to inform much more of what I would call the background culture, but just a kind of the milieu that people like you and me, people who live in Western liberal democratic countries, live and breathe on kind of daily basis. So that's the theory of my book. That's the kind of basic pitch of my book. I'm trying to furnish the name for the thing that not all seculars, but a lot of seculars should be pointing to as the source of who they are. And just to be clear, I mean, we all know this, but that's a ton of people, right? So in the United States, the no religion group now counts for 30-ish%, and it's this fastest growing group. You go to places like godless New Zealand, and it's like 60. The UK is just starting to tip over to plus 50. And so I don't want to say all these people are going to be kind of liberal all the way down, as I call them in my book, but I want to say a whole bunch of them do, for the reason that that's the sort of mainstream culture we inhabit. And I'll just say once more, and then we can bounce back. But one of the big inspirations actually for my book is conservative critics of liberalism. And I'm sure we'll get deeper into this, but fans of liberalism, politicians, journalists, academics, tend to see liberalism as this political thing. But Christian conservatives don't see it that way at all. They see it very much in the way that I'm trying to say, where they feel deeply threatened because kind of the whole zeitgeist of a culture is starting to be liberalized. And we can get more into this, of course, but I disagree with them on the condemnation. They think it's terrible politically. They think it's terrible psychologically. Obviously, I'm not on board that message. This is a defense of liberalism. But I think in terms of scope, they're not just kind of onto something. I think they're accurate. I think they're correct about that perception, about where our mainstream culture kind of sits right now. And it's just kind of liberal through and through, such that most people acquire their liberalism not like through civics lesson or by reading the Constitution. They get it through TikTok, they get it through YouTube, they get it through dating apps, they get it through whatever, just the million and one things we do every day.
Right. Yeah. I definitely want to come to that for sure. I have a few thoughts there. So one of the things you were mentioning is something that has come up a little bit more recently. I'd say the past 6 months, I've seen it come up more with a variety of different shades of it. Something I've talked about with certain friends of mine as well. And there is this extremely aggravating and very, I think, inaccurate and frustrating notion that, well, much of what we enjoy in the so-called West, let's say, and within secular culture, well, underneath all of that and behind all of that historically, that's just from Christianity. That's just from Christendom, right?
Yeah.
That's, you go all the way back, 312, you go to Constantinople, blah, blah, blah. And then you go all the way forward in time, you get to the schism in 1062, 1068. But all of the things we have, right? All of the things we like about liberals, right? We like, free speech, rule of law, whatever these things are that people like, that's really just Christianity, as the kind of animating, engine, if you will. And so really, really, we should just be at the least secular Christians, because where else are you going to get your values and your morals from? And you get tradition and you get history. And this kind of strange smuggling and co-opting of this is just really fucking irritating. I'll be very honest. It's very irritating. Well, it bugs me because that's not true. I think you can have, for me, you can have values and morals without any religious anything, number one. I'm not saying it's better or worse. I'm just saying you don't. and the things that we have in secular culture are not some weird version of Christianity. Now, let me take a side ramp here. Absolutely, Christianity and the spread of Christianity for a long time, at least 1500 years, and how it impacted the Enlightenment and many other things that happened in this millennium. Sure, I'm not
Mhm.
discounting that there is an influence, there is an impact tremendously. I mean, absolutely. But to say, I have heard arguments that have gone so far as to say, well, if we didn't have Christianity or Christendom, we would not have any of the secular liberal values that we
Mhm.
so hold dearly and cherish and all these things. I mean, that's how far they go. And maybe there's like degradations in between. But so what's your kind of, I'm sure you've heard some of these arguments or something like that.
Mhm.
What's your kind of thoughts on this? And how do you kind of respond? I mean, you can pull some themes from the book if you want, but how do you kind of respond to this of saying, what the interaction or intersection is there?
So just to so I was with you just the last, but just a clarification. When you say is your claim that the secular values that are found in liberalism might be more culturally universal, and so that they don't have their they're not just kind of born and exclusive to Christianity, that they could be more universal values? Is that the kind of
Ye-
end point?
ye- yes, yes, mostly. I think at the very least, there's an impact. It's a variable, but I don't think we get those things
Yeah.
from Christianity or the spread of Christianity.
That's really okay. That's very interesting. It's a complicated question. I don't know how satisfactory my answer is going to be. So one thing I do believe quite firmly is I believe that secularism is a product of Christianity. So my the book that I love deeply. It's written by a Catholic Canadian and a Canadian to boot. Charles Taylor's A Secular
Yeah,
Age. It's
yeah,
this
yeah,
just
yeah, yeah,
monster book, but
yeah, yeah.
if you have a taste for it, it's terrific.
It's a good book. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a good book. And what he essentially says is that so the secular culture that sort of has taken hold the last 150 years is really, it didn't just kind of like one day, just people didn't just like, boom, stop believing in God. What happens is that it's a super slow burn, in particular through certain developments that happened in Western Christianity, and in particular through certain developments, intra-theological developments that happened during the Reformation, such that the Reformation started to stress certain aspects of Christian faith, and then slowly and slowly that got us to like things like especially the individual's ability to engage directly with the Bible, to make up his or her own mind about the
Hmm.
text,
Hmm.
a certain priority of the individual outside of church hierarchies and outside of the freight of tradition. So all that stuff are there's theological reasons why that stuff happened in Christianity. And those weren't secular reasons that were offered, but it just kind of it's the way the kind of history works with history makes chumps of us all, right? Like so it just develops and develops and it gets us to a place that the end point we're like it's like a frog being boiled in water. It's like a slow development, and then suddenly you find yourself in a totally different place with a totally different sensibility. So in some respects I don't feel you on this, because I do think that in so many respects liberalism is a working out of certain themes of Christianity. Where I do detect smugness, and where the smugness bugs me, is that Christians looking at liberals and saying kind of like, "What the hell? We have everything you have plus stuff.
Hmm.
So we have your values, plus we have these deep transcendental commitments, plus we have this doctrine that can scratch the God-sized hole in each of our hearts." And
Hmm.
so your ideology is like us light. It's like low-fat cheese. Like, what are you doing?
Right.
And
It's
um,
Diet Coke, right? Yeah.
yeah, it's Diet Coke.
Right.
Yeah, but not even the good
Right.
Diet Coke. It's like
Right.
what's
Coke
the
Zero,
shitty
whatever
U.S.
it is. Right.
cola? Anyways, that one.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
RC cola is what I'm thinking of.
Yeah. Oh
Yeah,
gosh,
yeah,
so
that's right.
gross.
And it's just and the presumption that liberalism is something that just serious people can't be satisfied with. It can't fulfill a three-dimensional person because it doesn't have those transcendent depths that Christianity has. That's something I find frustrating. I get it, but I feel that Christians often read a bunch of their own needs into the human condition as such, and presume that liberalism is just a shadow of a doctrine that can't scratch it. So I agree and disagree with what you said. I do think liberalism in important ways is a working out or a legacy of intra-Christian developments. But on the other hand, it bugs me when Christians claim with real kind of anthropological confidence that liberalism can't stand on its own 2 feet for real full-blooded people. That bugs me.
Hmm.
So I
Yeah.
kind of agree and disagree with you on that. Does that?
So on the last part, this kind of liberal plus kind of thing,
Yeah.
and what bugs you, we're totally aligned on that. We might be saying very similar things on the first part, but just in different ways. So I think how you're describing it and using the work of Taylor and everything is I would agree that there is liberalism does have a type of working out from Christianity. I just don't think the link between that is so direct.
Yeah. Okay.
So let me give you an example. So like when we think about like the Enlightenment, or even if you take for in the United States the founding fathers, if you can have, I think, religious overtures or themes, or you could personally be religious, but that's not necessarily contributing. So when I think of
Yeah.
Newton, when I think of many of the great physicists, when I think about economics, when I think about the founding fathers, many of them were deist or agnostic, but they used the language of the day, which was, very some version of religiosity. And even if some of these people, inventors or scientists or physicists, were personally religious, right? And some of them did have, Christian faith or et cetera. I don't think that's animating, Mendel and his, genetic revolution, or is it impacting many of the thinkers that we have from the Enlightenment era, or if you look at the founding fathers, maybe Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton were using some of that language, under God or whatever. But in their personal life, they, what we know from their letters and their correspondence, very, very loosely believing that. So I just don't have this like direct link of, well, liberalism as it's forming, kind of like your frog analogy, is kind of coming out of, Christianity or Christendom. I think you could have this is my point. You could have got those things. You could have got those inventions. You could have got those ideas without any religion. I think these things are
Yeah.
religious. I don't think they're necessitated by that. And that's, kind of the second point was like,
Yeah.
yes, some of the people now, the kind of arrogance that people say is like, well, no, you do need that. And that's how you have to do it. So I'm going to convert to Christianity to be a secular Christian and all this nonsense. So I don't know, maybe we're saying kind of the
I
same
think we're
thing
saying
of
the same
like,
thing. Yeah, I think
yeah,
so.
yeah.
Like one of my other jobs is I work on human rights, as I'm a human rights scholar, and human rights are, in one kind of narrow sense, a Western invention. Like they happened in the United States and in the French Revolution, end of the 18th century. So in terms of, and so they didn't happen importantly in the middle of the Middle Ages or in China at the same time or whatever. They were born of a particular moment. But it's one question, and so then critics kind of lay in and say, well, human rights are just a Western kind of invention. And I think that just confuses two questions. One is of historical genesis, and two is of kind of its conceptual nature. And we can distinguish them. So I think that when I say that, if to draw the analogy, that human rights are Western or that liberalism is Christian, I think we can agree as a matter of historical record that it comes out of those traditions and has important kind of legacies from them, but I don't think it makes them conceptually wedded to them in a very hard way, such that now, once the baby starts walking on its own, it constantly needs that crutch or that support from it. It's a child. It becomes autonomous. It does its own thing.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So we're saying the same thing then. I think we're saying it a little bit differently, but I think, yes, I agree with everything you're saying there. I think that's Tom Holland did this in Dominion, right? He talked a lot about this, and from a historical perspective, I think he has a lot. I don't agree with everything. He's very lovely. He was on a podcast talking about his new book on Roman history. No, it was Pax. It was about the Pax Romana. It was a great book, and he's
that guy's
very
urbane in a way I can't imagine.
Yeah, he's really awesome. But yeah, I don't agree with everything in the book, but I think the general thrust of it, I think, is yes. And is this kind of point of the impact? I think he kind of leans a little bit too heavily on it. But so I think we're saying the same thing. But so aside from the splitting hairs bit of it, where we definitely agree is how and this is why it's important, right? So it's not just a kind of academic exercise or disagreement. I think that we should have those. We can acknowledge the impact and historical influence and all these things, but you have a lot of people going around thinking they need to convert to Christianity so they can get their liberal values.
Yeah.
And that to me is
That's interesting.
wrong. I mean, you can do it if you want. I'm not saying that you can't do it. People can do what they want. I just don't think you need to get those values. Excuse me. I don't think you need to convert to a religion, however you practice it, to get those values. How do you see this?
I agree with that.
Yeah. How can we? What's the message we can say there? Right? To say like you can still have these values, from liberalism in and of itself. How do we tease that out?
That's the pitch of the book. So the starting point though of my book is sort of unique in this way. So I think we can all agree that modern Western culture fucks us up in a lot of important ways. We're just kind of like, it has all these temptations, all of these forces, whether that's to kind of like the consumerism and crassness of capitalism, whether that's to kind of the loneliness of the hustle culture and all of this stuff. And people are looking widely for meaning and fulfillment in their lives that they think the kind of like straight up version of, like the kind of surface level version of their culture denies them, or in some makes them vulnerable in important respects. And religion was, of course, the kind of go-to way for that, but a lot of people have lost conviction in that. So now there's just this absolutely booming self-help industry as to like, where do we find our ballast now? And so that's a mainstream genre, but it's also a very popular genre in philosophy right now today. And all of those books make the same move in a sense, which is to try to look for our salvation, us moderns living in Western culture, in something other than Western, not other than the kind of mainstream culture that we inhabit. So we go look to the Scottish Enlightenment for answers from Adam Smith. We look to the early modern French period with Montaigne. We look to China. We look to Africa. We look to art as therapeutic. And all of that stuff is cool, and I don't want to throw any shade whatsoever, but my book is coming at it from a different perspective, which is to say, maybe the way out is just go through, or in a sense, the answer is in the room. What if we live in a liberal culture, and it doesn't live up to, it's not the greatest, obviously, the mainstream culture is not the greatest, but the ideals that animate it and that we pay lip service to are noble ideals. So things like fairness, reciprocity, tolerance, a certain degree of kind of lightness and irony and perspectivism, all that stuff is sort of mainstream culture now. And my book is playing the idea, what if we seek our salvation by diving further into the ideals that we already profess? And that's where I want to locate them in this doctrine of liberalism, because I think it's a historically rich tradition and a contemporary rich tradition. And we already have the answer in front of us. It's the purloined letter. It's there. It's so obvious you can't see it. I'm not saying it's for everyone, but it's definitely a viable path forward. And that's the pitch I try to make in the book.
Yeah. Absolutely. You do it very well. So I want to first, you started going there. So I want to, define liberalism. I know that's kind of difficult, but to define it, but then we can talk about the many versions of it, because this is where things get a little messy, especially when you start loading it with political kinds of things here. So, you talk about, in terms of defining it, individual rights, rule of law, separation of powers, judicial review, free and fair elections, progressive taxation, open markets. All of these are elements of liberalism. So, yeah, how do you define it generally, like as a concept, like as an idea, and where do those kind of pieces fit in there?
Okay, that's a big question. I'm going to keep it as unpedantic as I can, but I have to go with minimal pedantry to start, which is, so the dictionary definition, I'll get to the dictionary definition, it's just not that helpful. So history is actually very instructive, I think, as to what liberalism has been and what liberalism might be and certainly could be again. Okay, so liberalism, by the standards of intellectual history, is like basically a newborn. It's 200 years old. It's kind of the newest kid on the block, and people only call themselves liberal in a recognizable sense, so like the way we would use the word in the early 19th century, first in Spain in reaction to Napoleon, and then within 10 years it just sort of blew up and went all over Europe and then the United States. Anyways, point is, it's a relatively new doctrine. But on the other hand, it's a very old idea in the sense that the word liberal contains the old Latin words, which is liber and liberalis. And those discourses had been at the heart of Western civilization in all of these different versions for a long, long time. So, but the key thing about the word liber, and also about liberal as we use it today in English, is that it combines two qualities. And we forget about that. On the one hand, of course, it means freedom. So liberal means liberty. So on the one hand, it's the capacity and the standing of people to be free. But on the other hand, liberal and liber also means generous. So not liberty this time, but liberality. And we preserve this meaning in the word liberal today, all the day in English. So like if I ask for a liberal serving of soup, I'm not asking for a politically progressive soup. I'm asking for a big ass portion of soup. And so we have that idea of like muchness and abundance in the word liberal. So that's the kind of the big history behind that word. And it's there's a book I absolutely love. I'll recommend it. It's Helena Rosenblatt wrote a book called The Lost History of Liberalism, and that was published a few years ago by Princeton. And she does this word history of liberal and just how it keeps on getting reinvented in Western civilization all the time. So for the ancient Romans, it meant like generous with one's life and money. Christians went with the idea of charity. The word liberal is in the King James Bible about a dozen times, always in connection with giving to the poor. And then you have a reinvention of that in the early modern period. Anyways, but the point is by the time you rock up to the 19th century, when the word is really kind of created, the ideology is created, you have this 2,000-year-old history of an aspiration to be free and generous people. What happens in the 19th century is absolutely fascinating, and I can go into it. No, I won't go into it too much. But liberals looked at people that lived, people who we now name as liberals, but they were just kind of thinkers, actors, statesmen, writers, and they were looking around at their time, and it freaked them out. They looked at all of these developments happening in modern Western societies, and they just saw it as just a train wreck, both for our politics, but also for our psychology. So they looked at some of the things I mentioned earlier, like capitalism. They're like, holy shit, this is going to turn everyone into consumerist, nasty little creatures. They looked at democracy especially, and they're like, uh-oh, this could be bad, because on the one hand, power would start to be wielded by the common man, which would lead to tyranny of the majority, populism, all that sort of stuff. But on the other hand, cultural power would start to be wielded by the common man, so that we would just get like kind of the lowest, crassest shit that would start to all of a sudden pass for taste, art, and distinction. And so what liberals did in the 19th century is tried to create a political and psychological doctrine that would try to not push back, but mediate, buffer these sorts of forces to try to allow ordinary people to be free and generous individuals in a culture that was relentlessly trying to make them otherwise, towards making us kind of little bots, crass material, all that stuff. So that's what the early animating spirit of liberalism was. And the take-home point, I'm getting lost a little bit in the weeds here, but my take-home point is, at its root, liberalism in the 19th century by its founders was a simultaneously political and ethical doctrine. It was that twofold thing, that it never, at its heart, was questions about how to live well and the good life. So a really interesting question arises: what the fuck happened to liberalism? When did liberalism retrench itself so much so that we now think of it not only just as a political doctrine, but as something often as kind of like a diss, like it means someone who is individualistic, egoistic, only cares about their own rights and entitlements. And the intellectual history here is really interesting about why liberalism walked itself back to something more narrow. And I don't want to go into it, but in the early 20th century, classical liberalism was born as an ideology by kind of right-wingy types who were freaked out by socialism and progressivism. And so they tried to retrospectively cook up a doctrine that stressed market freedoms, individual liberties, all that stuff. Then in the Cold War, you had a bunch of thinkers, Cold War liberals. Sam Moyn did a great work on this called Liberalism Against Itself. The idea here being that Cold War liberals were, in some sense, justifiably freaked out by collectivist totalitarian societies, and they decided that liberalism should just really be about like barriers to protect each other from doing bad things to each other, and especially to protect us against our states. And those states were often like really aggressively foisting upon their populations very emphatic vision of the good life that wasn't necessarily shared. So liberals were like, dude, we can't go that way. We have to make this a more minimal, more plural, more inclusivist doctrine. And so those are good reasons. I don't want to criticize any of that exactly. But what the effect of it happened is to diminish our understanding of liberalism as something strictly political, legal, maybe even individualistic, away from something more fulsome and generous that it could be today, and I think is lived by many of us today. And so that's where I wind up. So what I want to, so the long definition of liberalism here. So liberal means a combination of free and generous. And we've split those two apart, and we've forgotten especially about the generous bit. And then, where then we can, I'll say the name and I'll stop and we can navigate there if you like. Where I really draw my definition of liberalism is from the great political philosopher of the 20th century, which is John Rawls. And he had an idea that he's a tremendously complicated political philosopher, but at the root of his doctrine is a very, very simple idea, which is that our societies should be fair systems of cooperation from one generation to the next. And it's that idea of fairness that he really cashes out, and he turns liberalism into this doctrine, this worldview, this political ideology that tries to specify what fairness might mean for our countries, for our laws, for our distribution and our economies, but also for us as members of them, as just kind of ordinary people living our life, of what it would mean to be liberal today, which is to say free and generous beings of liberty and liberality. So that's what I tried to reconcile, is these two meanings, and show how putting those together in the right way can be a really awesome way to live. It can be something, and not just like a serious, heavy, I'm always concerned with social justice and stuff like that. Also just fun and joyful and light, and just can be full and flourishing. That's what I want to say.
Yeah, no, it's very well explained. It's rare to hear somebody kind of really unpack it, a little bit historically, and then explain like what we're actually saying here.
Right.
To that end, we'll get to Rawls for sure, but so let's just jump all the way to kind of the present. Definitely this, I mean, it does load politically, but when you ask somebody, are you a liberal, or, even if you mean that politically, or even just not, I feel like you get, most people don't know how to define it. And then some people give some version. There's many versions out there, these liberalisms, I think you mentioned it in the book.
Yeah.
And then you have the classic people that are classically liberal. People say that. There's a lot of different things where people will say, they're liberal, and then you hear them explain it. It's like, that's not liberal. So yeah, tell us about these kind of liberalisms, the classical liberal thing, which you mentioned, and how to kind of navigate some of that.
That's great. So I had a conversation with one of the great historians of liberalism a couple of years ago that stuck with me. It's very simple what he said, but so is Michael Freeman, who was at Oxford. He wrote like the very short introduction to liberalism, but he's written a ton. He's great. He's incredibly learned, and he just kind of broke it down for him. He's like, look, Alex, the tradition of liberalism is so vast and complicated that I like to think of it as modular furniture. So there's like, you're in a room with a bunch of stuff in the room, and you can move the stuff around. And liberalism has a bunch of like key components that most anyone would recognize as like part of the liberal family or game. So things like freedom, personal freedom, tolerance, fairness, those sorts of things are like, then there's a bunch of others, but you could list like a bunch of top line concepts. And his idea is that, look, all the different liberal traditions do is just take one of those modular furniture bits, say the individual freedom bit, and put it at the center of the room and make that the showpiece of the room. And so liberalism is such a capacious tradition that you can do that, no problem. So I think I don't see myself as a libertarian, but I get it. I get why that would be in the family of liberalism, because it just jumps up, it just kind of steroids, it just pumps up, inflates one of the main concepts. And you can just do what you want. So in the sense, I've written a book where if I'm an interior designer with this modular furniture, my centerpiece here is this fairness business, which I take off from Rawls. And in part that's a little bit stipulative. I'm saying this is what I think liberalism is. But why I like Rawls so much is how he sources his idea of fairness. And so Rawls doesn't start, again, I'm going to just tiptoe to the Rawls line and I'm going to walk it back. But Rawls doesn't start by like first order moral principles or by saying, I, John Rawls, extraordinarily important philosopher, say this. What Rawls does is he just starts kind of like, he's just like an observer. He's just like looking around his political culture of the United States. And he's like, okay. When I look at all its major artifacts, I look at the Constitution, I look at political speeches, I look at historic speeches, I look at Supreme Court decisions. What at the end of the day is the fundamental moral proposition enshrined in there? And he digs and digs and digs and digs. And finally he hits the kind of pay dirt or bedrock. And that bedrock for him is this idea of fairness and, let's say, reciprocity. The idea that I matter no more than you and you matter no more than I, and that society should be set up as a kind of scheme of mutual benefit where you and I can mutually flourish together, not grossly just by running our own game, but with a genuine concern for one another and for ourselves. And that would be the general idea. And so that's the kind of bedrock level. And why I think Rawls's way of proceeding is very intuitively appealing to me is that he's not stipulating. He says, look, this is basically what you already believe in. If you've been socialized in this culture, then ideas of reciprocity run deep in you. And so he's trying to affirm what citizens at some fundamental level already think of themselves. And it's like you say, I have this line in the book, something like, to say that a liberal society is fair, it's like telling a handsome man he's handsome or a smart lawyer that she's smart. They'll be like, yeah, cool, I get that. And the reason they get that is because they've been raised in this freaking thing their whole life long, and so they've imbibed that. So that's where I want to base this definition, but I very much acknowledge that liberalism is a plural tradition with multitudes. And one of my pastimes is I read a lot of right-wing American news. And so particularly I read a lot of Breitbart, you know what Breitbart is?
Oh yeah.
Right. And I read this, especially, I mean, the action on, Steve Bannon himself says, and I totally agree, the action of Breitbart happens in the comment section, not in the articles. And so you go to the comment section and they're an active bunch, right? Like New York Times, typical op-ed will get like 1,000 comments. Breitbart, you're a minimum of 5,000 comments or anything. They're just hopping over there. Anyways, you go to the comments and you kind of sort, and half of it is, I think, just racist, xenophobic badness. But I think half of it, maybe more than half, is right-wing liberal arguments for a certain vision of right-wing liberal society. So, for example, when Breitbartians or right-wing Americans oppose illegal immigration, some of it's racist, but a lot of it is not racist. And a lot of it is based on the idea that illegal immigrants have jumped the queue and they have come to the society and are claiming its benefits and are shaping its cultures in ways that they and their forebears didn't participate or didn't contribute at all. So what my point is that that's an argument based out of fairness. That is that's a recognizably liberal argument. And it's interesting when you zoom out at a certain level, how much of the kind of what we think is like conservatives versus liberals, that's just a weird labeling for what are deep but intra-liberal disputes as to what a fair society would look like. So the idea of fairness is the core of what I'm saying, and it's the core of what I'm saying because a lot of people already buy it. But the idea of fairness has so much wiggle room within it that it can generate all kinds of controversies to the point where the participants recognize themselves as almost combatants rather than fellow travelers.
Have you heard these phrases? You know, I'm a liberal conservative. I'm a conservative liberal. Have you heard these phrases that people use? Sure. Where there's this kind of mixing and matching, and I guess kind of sort of, I do like the analogy of the furniture and where someone has the centerpiece. That's a very good analogy. How do we, when we think about, you know, for example, if you juxtapose liberalism with conservatism, you know, and this is a little bit philosophical and political in the U.S. at least. It does expand outward to other places, but you know, many people will say, well, I'm a Burkean conservative, kind of the father of conservatism, which is fine, but you don't meet a lot of people that believe in Edmund Burke, right? They don't even know who that is, right? It's like, well, that's great. Like you're maybe a little well-read, maybe you're aspiring to the OG kind of version of this, but you ask most people that, you know, voted for whomever in the Republican Party, they don't know who the fuck Edmund Burke is or what the true values of conservatism is. So I guess there is this, it's still kind of on the same through line here is, you know, you have the libertarians, you have the liberals, you have conservatives and others. How do we, not who has the right way, but how do we interact with people that are using different words or language where it's getting to the essence of what it means to be these things? Because I think things morph and change over time, which is fine. But a lot of people that say that they're conservative probably aren't, and vice versa for liberals. So
Right.
how do you have this kind of juxtaposition of everyone's thinking there's something and maybe it's not, and I guess does it matter? I think in some ways it does, but how do you kind of sift through all of those ways in which people are kind of identifying as?
There's a lot in that question. Okay, that's a good question. Let me start with a side brag.
Yeah, please.
But my book yesterday today, I don't know what, was mentioned in the New York Times by
Oh,
the
no,
last
congrats.
Christian conservative of all, David Brooks, right? That
There you
guy
go.
is the
Yeah,
brand of what
uh-huh.
you're talking about. He's a
Yeah,
conservative
yeah,
liberal.
yeah.
Um, there's so much to say about this question, and I'm just worried I'm going to like turn into a shotgun and just go a million
No,
directions.
no, that's all right. Go ahead. Go however you
No, I'm
feel.
worried for my own kind of coherence here. Okay. First thing is the easy one. I'll just say it and then I can disconnect it. The first one is that I'm in a sense a liberal. I'm not a conservative. I'm not a conservative. But the idea that the founding conservative, genuine conservative idea is that our longstanding institutions have built in longstanding wisdom, and that our main institutions are repositories of trial and error truths that human beings have arrived at over untold generations. And if we take a wrecking ball to them, that's suicidal because we
Mm,
can't just recreate those at will because they have all of these insights embedded in them. And so if we start smashing them, we just can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And so
mm,
I'm a believer in that idea, that conservative idea. And in particular, I have to be for my book and the pitch I'm making, because at root, I'm saying liberalism isn't just a fine set of moral principles. I'm not a Jacobin at all. I'm saying that liberalism has in fact started to descend into all of our institutions and all of our interactions, such that our built environment, our embodied practices and habits, our felt dispositions that were taught as kids, all that stuff is become liberal, and liberalism has dug itself like a tick, if you like, into our
mm,
fundamental institutions. And so in that sense, I'm a preservationist or a conservationist. I think we have to be very careful with these things. So I think that that's a real deep human, sociological as well, truth of conservatism. So I'm down with that. So yeah, so now I have two directions of answer. First is, how do you tell people on the right who are liberal conservatives from a person who is conservative? I mean, I don't have a hard litmus test, but I would say an affirmation of reciprocity of all citizens that's, I think, at the core of the moral adventure of liberalism. The idea that no matter who you are, no matter what you're standing, you count as the same moral quantum and political quantum as other people. And I think that if you're on the right and affirm that, then I think you're a liberal. I just think you have a slant, like I have a slant, and that's cool. If you don't believe that, I think you're something else. And in particular, I think that you're a Democrat. So today we think of liberalism as a Democrat. Sorry, I'm forgetting I'm talking to someone in the United States. I don't mean a Democratic Party member. I mean someone who believes in democracy as
mhm,
unalloyed or unmediated by liberalism.
mhm,
So at root, I think it's very important to preserve the original 19th century idea that liberalism and democracy are in deep and fundamental tension at some level.
mm,
Democracy is about the will of the majority. Liberalism is about the flourishing, let's say, of individuals. And if you
mm,
start to list all of the main liberal institutions that we all know, individual rights, division of power, judicial neutrality, all that stuff, all of them are 19th century, all of them are 19th century features that are all expressly counter-majoritarian institutions. All of those are
mm,
designed in important respects to just put the brakes on popular power and say, whoa, 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 majorities, you can't just run roughshod over individuals. So all of those institutions are in tension with democracy in some important respects. And so it rolls off the tip of the tongue today when we say, oh, liberal democracy. We think it's like this freaking picnic basket that's always existed as
mhm.
pre-packed and nice, but it's not. It's a hard-won reconciliation between two ideologies that pull in opposite directions. And where I think conservatives are doing, and this isn't a censorious critical comment, I think it's just a descriptive one, is I think they're trying to unlink democracy from liberalism and trying to restore important aspects of popular power, both culturally and politically, that might not be so nice about preserving individual liberty. So if I were to identify who is a conservative and who is a liberal, I think conservatives today are democratic in a robust sense and are willing to unlink the trailer to liberalism. Does that kind of make
Mm,
sense?
mhm, mhm,
And my
mhm.
last comment is, okay, so here though, I don't have any, my book isn't written for conservatives. I take inspiration from them as seeing something about our cultural moment that is accurate. But my book is really directed at kind of like wishy-washy, pretend liberals like myself who profess to being free and fair and generous individuals, but in so many ways we know that that's just bullshit and that we don't live up to our ideals.
Mm-hmm.
And my book is just kind of a call to try to commit to liberalism, and I can talk as to what my pitch is, like why that might be a good thing to do, it's a very important part of my book. But one of the main things would be, is interpretive generosity. I just don't see there's no one in this culture war that's going to win. And I think if liberals want to claim the mantle of generosity, that doesn't just mean paying higher taxes. It also means, I think, being open and willing to listen and hear other points of view, particularly conservative points of view, without pouncing on them immediately with recrimination or canceling or contempt or something like that. So it's a spirit of generosity that extends to hermeneutic generosity, interpretive generosity, and just to try to turn the frickin' dial down on the kind of like mutual, like the Schmittian dynamic that we have right now of mutual othering and attacking, and in part try to see as best we can the reasonableness of other positions, and in particular how their alignment with values that we ourselves profess. So like I think that example from Breitbart I gave a second ago, that's just a little thing, but it's seeing how it's seeing how conservatives inhabit the same moral universe as liberals. They're just taking a different slant on it. And once you can start to see that, then you can disagree all you like and you can disagree intensely, but at least you have a basis to move forward with a shared set of commitments that allow both sets of interlocutors to recognize themselves in what they're talking about. And so often when I read the culture war, especially the United States, I just don't think that the way the right talks about the left and the way the left talks about the right, they're talking about actual people anymore. Like the way in which the right talks about the left as wanting, above all, to control everything. I just don't see that. I just don't recognize that as a drive amongst liberals. But the way in which liberals talk about conservatives as intractably cruel or as something like that, that's true for some, and it's true for those liberals that some want to control. But I think those are fringy, weird elements, and I think we just need to take a frickin' beat and dial down the temperature. And it's on liberals, I think, in the first instance, given our doctrine calls for generosity, to make to not cast the first stone or extend the olive branch. I don't know what metaphor you want.
Yeah, I think you're totally right, and you see some of that convergence in certain issues. Like, I'm not trying to open this can of worms, but you see that with like people's like bodily rights, like like, oh, I'm not gonna get this vaccine, but you had a lot of like really crunchy West Coast liberals that were also saying kind of like, yeah, I'm not gonna eat stuff with GMOs in it, and I'm not gonna, you know what I mean? Like there's that like kind of circle kind of meets at a certain point, or I could think of other topics or areas as well. Again, I'm not trying to open this can of worms either, as sort of kind of related, but there's a handful of people that are formerly on the left or formerly on the right that definitely give a hard look to RFK Jr. And again, the guy's got some fucking batshit crazy ideas, but there is. I'm not making a case for RFK Jr. just for the record.
That's what I took you to be doing right now.
But there is a kind of, amidst all the crazy, there's a kind of levelness. Like he kind of squares with people on this, and he doesn't demonize as much. Trump's going to demonize. Biden's going to, do the thing with his group and his party and, all that kind of stuff. And you just don't see that much. And I think this is why, especially in the United States, in the Midwest, Wisconsin and Michigan, populism really is a thing. And it doesn't matter if it's left or right-wing populism. All this to say, there is a convergence with people of, yeah, you could be on the left or the right, Democrat, Republican, but on certain things in the right space, you're going to see people align. That does happen.
I agree completely.
Often. And people that are surprised by that, to me, are too much in a bubble. Yeah. They're way too insular. They're way too much in an echo chamber. And it's like, that shouldn't be surprising.
100%. If I can propose a constitutional amendment for your country that I'd like you to try to make happen,
please.
Mandatory voting is just, we have that in Australia. It's amazing. It's a great thing. Good because the left and the right party are pretty close to one another. And then you don't have candidates coming up as this, like RFK coming up as like seeming like the sane person in the room. That wouldn't happen here because the parties have so much broad consensus because they have to appeal constantly to a majority to a population that's obliged to vote lest they get a $500 fine. It's never, obviously I know the realities, that's never gonna happen, but it is a great institution. I was skeptical when I got there. I'm like, that's amazing.
No, I've been for it for a long time. I mean, I don't, but I don't know, some of the ways in which the United States kind of came about was very rebellious. We have a history of being rebellious and kind of anarchistic. It's just so telling us what to do. It's just very much like it takes a lot to do
we
that.
Live free or die. We have vote or get fined. I get that it's a different ethos. So yeah, I get it, but I'm still saying that sucks for you. That's all.
But I agree with you though. I think there's a good amount of people that would probably be on board for that. But okay, so let's talk about Rawls. I mean, he's a huge main character in the book, and you can just kind of give us the 90 second overview of him. But essentially though is why was he such a main force or big piece for you in looking at liberalism? I'm assuming here you're going to talk about fairness and what that is. You started touching on it earlier, but why is he such a powerhouse here for really understanding liberalism secularly?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I'm a late convert. Some people are raised on the mother's milk of Rawls. I was raised on feisty French philosophy that told me he was a shill and all that stuff. Anyway, so I've matured.
But maybe the French philosophers get over there to Canada a little bit easier than here. Here in the United States, Rawls and the Theory of Justice. Everyone's read that in some undergrad.
You what? Sorry.
Yeah, a lot of people read Rawls in undergrad. Sure. If you're like in a English literature or philosophy, you're going to read a theory.
You're going to read Rawls. Yeah, no, that's right. So short thing. So Rawls for the 5 readers of your listeners of yours who haven't encountered this guy. So he is a political philosopher. He was born in 1920s in Baltimore, a place that you know well.
It's a great place. It's a great place. It's lovely.
He had a very tragic youth. This is not integral to understanding Rawls's work, but I mention it just because it's interesting and it does explain some stuff. On 2 separate occasions, so he's a boy. He had his lawyer. His dad was a lawyer, kind of a hustler, a bit of a charlatan, hustler kind of guy. Mom was very educated, teacher and piano player. And anyways, when Rawls was a boy, this is unbelievable, on 2 separate occasions, he passed fatal illnesses to his brothers that killed them. So he passed diphtheria to one of them and something else, some sort of pneumonia to the other. And on 2 occasions, so he was really ill. He was like 4 and 6. And his brothers wanted to play with him, even though he was sick. They did, and they died as a direct result of the communication. I mean, I laugh because it's so traumatizing. Anyways, he had to stammer for the rest of his life from the trauma. Very, very soft-spoken, very modest man. He was a soldier in Second World War, decorated for bravery. Worked as a radio operator behind Japanese lines. Got the Purple Heart. Anyways, and so he wanted to be when he was a young man at Princeton, he wanted to be a theologian, minister, and he was just about to enter seminary school. And he wrote his undergraduate thesis on the concepts of sin and faith in Christianity. And in the Second World War, he lost his faith, and partly because of knowledge of the camps, but also just because of his experience in the Pacific Theater. And he came back an unbeliever, and he became a political philosopher. And in, I think, very important respects, he's trying to reanimate a certain kind of theological vision. This goes back to our Christianity question, but there's certain core moral commitments from the 19-year-old Rawls that you read in his Sin and Faith thesis about the importance of relationality, especially he has this incredibly strong aversion and a pride of people thinking they're special and what that they deserve the rewards that came to them because they're handsome or because they're smart or even because they're hardworking. All of that, he's deeply, he's almost Calvinist in this respect. He's like not but the grace of God for early Rawls, and then a liberal order for the later Rawls. Do we acquire what we are? Anyways, so then he wrote, when he was 50, he wrote A Theory of Justice, a work of a rather mature age, and it was an immediate bestseller. It was right in the zeitgeist. A book I recommend very strongly on this is Katrina Forster's In the Shadow of Justice, where she gives this genealogy of, because no book is successful on the merits of its own ideas alone. There's always a sociology of perception that makes a hit. And so his was at the right time of trying to provide an alternative theory to utilitarianism, which was the big game in town, and providing a basis for civil disobedience during the Vietnam era. Anyways, there's a bunch of reasons why this clicked at the moment, but it clicked in a way that I remember in an interview, he said something like, yeah, I published it, thought a few friends would read it. And within a decade, there were hundreds of books on it, thousands of articles. By now, it's sold 500,000 copies. And this is a freaking difficult book. This is a book that its own publisher calls like an abstruse work of philosophy. It's not, you wouldn't expect your editor to sell it that way, but that's what it is. And so anyways, so like I said, it's a very complicated book, but there's this early review of Rawls that said he had a nice metaphor for the book. He said it was like a Gothic cathedral. And he said, Theory of Justice is like Gothic cathedral because it combines, on the one hand, simplicity of plan, and on the other hand, complexity of detail. And I think that's just exactly right. I like the theological finesse too of that, but it's really simple. The simple idea is that society should be a fair system of cooperation. And then what Rawls does is he specifies, so he says that, and then he's like, hey, liberals, if you vibe with me, if you feel that at root society is kind of a fair system of cooperation, but really ought to be more, and we should be doing better at that, then let me lay out a whole bunch of principles by which we can make that a reality. Principles that apply to our top moral intuitions, principles that apply to our institutions, both political and economic, and then principles that apply to our psychology and our development and how we raise kids. So those are the three big sections of A Theory of Justice, one on principles, one on institutions, the third on kind of moral development, moral psychology. And in it, he's giving not just a picture of what a liberal society would be like, but I think this is my French training coming out, what the Heidegger or someone like that would call an existential analytic of what it means to be liberal, like a full, robust portrait of who we are, us liberals are in our bones. And so Rawls was writing in the 1970s, and he felt liberalism was saturated, which is an interesting fact. This is a sidebar, but 1970s is when, so Rawls is often read, and I think fairly justly, as sort of the high point, watershed moment of welfare state capitalism and of some sort of redistributive, fairness-oriented set of institutions and orientation. But 1971 is, of course, the moment when neoliberalism is starting to be cooked up, when you have early Chicago schools starting to do its thing, and then 9-10 years later, you have Margaret Thatcher, then you have Reagan. And then it's one of those sad moments in political philosophy that happen all the time when the height of an ideology doesn't realize that it's about to have its throat slit. It's like it's carrying on like it's the game. It is the thing, but it's about not to be the thing. Anyways, so we live at. There's so many sidebars here. We live in a very interesting moment here in 2020s where, on the one hand, I think a lot of our intuitions are Rawlsian, and we do believe this fairness stuff. But on the other hand, we've been living in the shadow or wake of neoliberalism for 40 years, and a lot of our institutions have been gutted. So we have this robust moral intuition combined with an anemic institutional dispensation, and it's like, how do the two fit? They don't really. Anyways, that's another part of the conversation that we can go to about how we are kind of liberal and not liberal at the same time. But yeah, so Rawls fleshes out this idea of society being a fair system of cooperation, and he identifies it in its political culture. But where I take it in my book is I say, okay, this is the conservative truth moment, I think, where conservatives see that it's just gone way bigger than that, and that's where it floods. If I can just say, this is a little off topic, but in case I've been a little bit abstract right now in how I've been talking about liberalism, but let me give you a very concrete way in which I think that we are liberals deep down, in the sense that this fairness idea has infiltrated who we are through and through. And it's going to sound out there, and it's a bit of a wild one, but just hang in there for 2 minutes. But it's the history of swear words, and I talk about this in my books. I think
I like this part in the book. I actually
it's
really
a cool,
like
interesting topic. So there's this awesome book published by an author named Melissa Moore, M-O-H-R, about 10-ish years ago, and it's called Holy Shit, A Brief History of Swearing by Oxford University Press. And the title is genius because it's the thesis. She says that if you look back over the 3,000 years of Western civilization, basically there's two kinds of swear words. There's your holy words, which are sacrilegious words, and then there are your shit, obscenity kind of words. And at different moments in time, a different swear word will be the truly taboo word. The different category of swear word will be the truly taboo word of your time. So you go back to kind of Judaism, to start at the early, and then it's the sacrilegious words. And then in Roman civilization, it's the obscenities. Do you remember from the book, fun quiz, do you remember what's the worst thing you could say to a fellow Roman? Like what gets their hairy chest bristling in a heartbeat?
I remember reading this, but I can't remember what it is.
Yeah, okay. It's to call them terms of sexual passivity. So you would call them a sissy or a cunt in the sense of a receiving sexual organ, or like a bottom in sex. Why? Because that insulted and impugned their idea that they were this virile, male, active, penetrating citizen. Anyways, so the history of swear words is just such a cool topic because by looking at the words that a society deems are taboo, you immediately reverse engineer what a society thinks are its most fundamental moral commitments. Those words are those that abut or violate the commitments that we most deeply feel. Anyways, so up until recently, we were trapped in this kind of Victorian era about obscenities being the bad thing. So like fuck, shit, those kind of words. But those words now, I mean, I think we've been swearing rather liberally, as it were, on this podcast. And that's cool. Like no one, I mean, it's not professional, not like okay, but no one really gives a shit anymore.
Yeah, no one really cares.
To coin a phrase.
Right.
But so sometimes you have the idea that we're post swear words, but that I think is 100% not true. Because if there is a category because if I use a certain category of word, like say in my teaching, and I swear all the time in my teaching, no one's batted an eye in 15 years. But if I were to say this other category of word, I'd be reported within the day and fired within the week. And that category of word, of course, is slurs. So today, slurs are true taboo words, the words that we not just don't privately say, we don't want to privately say, we just don't go there anymore. And slurs, of course, the N word is at this top or the bottom of the pyramid, wherever you want to. And then, but you have slurs for sexuality, for disability, like even a word that would have been really tame as a kid and that I used as a kid would be like spaz, but now that's not cool anymore. And so you have all of these slurs being, are truly our swear words for today. Why are they our swear words today? Because they directly impugn the fundamental liberal moral commitment, which is something like fairness, which is something like creating, so a slur is like a missile aimed at the self-respect of another person. You're trying to denigrate them and get them to feel contemptible in their bones. And those kinds of words really undermine the main moral commitment of liberalism, which is this idea that everyone should have a strong, healthy self-esteem and be able to flourish in the way they so choose, et cetera, et cetera. So here's the point. So long excursus, here's the point. When I say we've gone liberal deep down and it's just in our bones, what I mean is stuff like that, where what we found outrageous or offensive is in ways unconscious, but totally saturated by liberal principles. So that I would never use the N-word in public or private because I'm liberal. That's why. And when did slurs become the major taboo word in our culture? 1970s. What's the 1970s? Well, it's the era of the civil rights. It's the era when liberalism really started to hit its stride. So that's not a coincidence. And what I try to do in the book is I try to give a lot of these kind of textured examples where I try to click with readers and say, hey, look in the mirror, man. You're liberal deep down in some important sense. So I talk about how we parent. I talk about the kind of questions we ask. I talk a lot about porn, which we can talk about if you want. I'm worried that section on porn is going to be my legacy. But the short version of the porn bit is that today, if you go to Pornhub and you sort the top videos, then all of the videos are really about toying with the idea of consent, and especially of trying to bring an initially unwilling sexual partner to a state of like sexual readiness or excitement. And why? So it's all kind of like the frisson of porn today is all basically playing with consent. Why? Because consent is the main moral line that we draw around sexually okay and sexually not okay sex. So if you want to make porn taboo today, you play with consent. That's the way in which you get people off by that idea. So there's so little nun porn today. And sorry, I say that a bit flippantly. Why is there so little nun porn? Because no one gives a shit. No one gives a shit about violating.
We don't care. Yeah, we don't care about the religious things.
About violating our voluntarism and our will to have sex. That's why if you sort the top 200 videos, not just a lot of them, the majority are going to be in this genre.
Yeah. Well, I think you're absolutely right, and it's more of a sort of a kind of like a pulse on kind of what the culture is, which is to your point about where liberalism is kind of embedded. There's a an element of this. I can bring in a few things here together, but the thing with fairness is the criticisms that get pushed onto it is, well, what fairness? What does that look like? What does the common good or fairness look like? how you define it. But, hey, somebody came and they attacked me or they did whatever. So we're going to go and bomb them to hell. We're going to fuck them up and they're never going to do that again. And we're fully justified in doing that.
I feel there's a
Um,
subtext here.
yeah, no, not really any subtext, but you can think of many current and even more recent in the past history occasions where that's happened. Or even if you take it one-on-one, a lot of people will say, yeah, fairness, being kind, that's just fucking weak. Like you're a soy boy. You're really, all these things, right? Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. You want to be fair and kind and nice, and okay, yeah. That says to me that you're weak. You're a pushover. You have no strength. You don't, take the world on squarely on your shoulders. All these things, and then I'm gonna bring in one of my favorites. Well, Nietzsche had ideas about, things about fairness and equality and all these other things. And so do we want to have a society like that with all of these, weak soy boys and all these other things that are just kind of being like, well, whatever, if you want to be nice and let's make sure we're having a fair, discussion on these things. And again, I'm not personally saying I believe all these things. I'm just there. You'll get a lot of counters for that. So how do we understand the kind of conversation here on this?
Yeah, no, okay, yeah. You ask, it's a weird word. You ask fecund questions. There's just a lot here, man. Okay, let me go with the first. So you're asking I'm going to take that, split that. So on the one hand, you're saying it can be a vague idea, like it means kind of anything to anyone. And on the other hand, you're saying this soy boy business, that it's like I use this, it's a womanish virtue. It's
Right. Mm-hmm.
yeah.
It's real, it's feminine or whatever people might say.
Okay. Let me take them one at a time. So the vague one is very interesting, and I think it's more true than not. So when Rawls talks about fairness, he's really talking about something very specific, and he's talking about the idea that no one deserves their starting point in society. So if you have a rich kid that's born in Palo Alto, you have a poor kid that's born in Detroit, there's no sense at all. There's no non-morally abhorrent sense in which you could say that kid somehow deserves to go to all the summer camps and all his private tutoring, and then the poor kid.
It's just luck.
It's just luck, and it's just so what we have to do. So that's just a fact in a sense. So that we have inequalities. That's in a sense a fact. What we do with those inequalities is where the moral picture kicks in, and so where liberalism tries to step up in this picture of fairness is to try to ensure that the least advantaged among us have the fairest opportunities, in a sense, or have that we try to that those people who don't deserve their starting point, that we use our inequalities of wealth and power to try to lift them up as most as possible. Rawls called that idea the difference principle, which is that inequalities are justified only insofar as they help benefit the least advantaged group of society, typically measured by index. But you get that. So to go back, it's a Christian insight at some level. To help Christianity is the doctrine.
Love your neighbor, turn the other cheek, all these things. Yeah.
Well, no, sure, but I guess I mean even more pointed that it's the doctrine that pays most attention to the weak.
Yes.
And liberalism does that, and so some versions of it, Rawls does that too. And Rawls, so I think you and I would very much agree that no one deserves their kind of social starting point, rich, poor. But Rawls goes further, and this is where I think a lot of people get off the Rawls boat, and I don't know if I'm on that boat fully or not. So his idea is that neither do we deserve our natural talents or the advantages that flow from them. So if I'm born super smart, or my incredible good looks, or what have you, and I reap rewards from that, then Rawls is saying, you didn't deserve that either. That's just the genetic lottery that you somehow hit the gold mine on. Or if you're disadvantaged, or if you're LeBron James and you have these particular talents that are so valorized at this particular moment, you didn't do any of that. It's not on you. But then Rawls also goes into the work ethic bit. And he's like, even if you worked hard and even if you weren't the smartest kid on the block, but you really studied your ass off and read, even that you don't deserve, because you probably had a supportive family that inculcated. So Rawls's anti-merit streak runs so deep that I think a lot of us get off the bus. So I think that's a point where he actually becomes morally controversial and doesn't say things that on the surface seem a little like platitudes. So it would be for your listener and for each of us to kind of think how deep down we agree with that, because Rawls's idea of fairness comes up very strongly against maybe the main moral commitment of our own society, which is meritocracy, which is that reward should track onto achievement, talent, and effort. And Rawls is saying, fuck that. That's not you. You didn't do that. You were raised. And so anyways, that's so fairness. So the point is that Rawls puts this fairness idea in helping the weakest among us, and he sets up an institutional scheme for that and tries to get people to regard themselves as on board that project. But he goes off the deep end. I'm not saying we don't have to follow them here, but I'm saying it's controversial ground as to whether or not we follow. Okay, so that's the Rawls picture of fairness. On the other hand, there's this whole other picture of fairness that critics of Rawls use all the time. So like neoliberals, for example, are all about fairness. And they say this with in good faith because they just have a different conception of fairness. So like when someone like Hayek comes along and writes about liberal principles and individual freedom, especially market freedoms, he's not a greedy guy. He's not like trying to make the rich class richer. He's saying that the market is a much more efficient and much more fair way to allocate costs and benefits of a society than any central planning of pricing or production or anything like that. So his argument is that the kind of micro decisions that all of us make at a market level is what's going to ensure a fair society better than any do-gooder political institutions like a socialist scheme. So we can disagree or not with the empirical veracity of that, but I think that we have to acknowledge that there's a moral vision animating those right-wingers, that it's not about like let it rip or like it's not that. There's a genuine beating moral vision that we have to contend to, and we have to acknowledge it. I think that's the first step towards doing this. If anyone's interested in a book that's excellent on this, my colleague down the street in Sydney wrote a book called Jessica White. She wrote a book called The Morals of the Marketplace, which is about trying to reconstruct the moral vision of the early neoliberal thinkers. But Thatcher's the same, man. We think of Thatcher as like, I eat coal miners for breakfast. But Thatcher was all about trying to liberate the individual from a certain weight of collectivism, from an inability to rise, all that stuff. So again, there's a moral vision of that. So this is a lot. So your question's still in my mind, which is that isn't fairness vague? And I think that fairness vague is the wrong word. Fairness is unspecified. And once you specify fairness, then you can go in very different directions. You can go in the more kind of social egalitarian direction, which is my thing. You can go in the more right-wing thing. And I definitely think a book could have been written and should be written about like libertarianism as a way of life. I think that's a robust ethic. It's not one I vibe with, but it can be done. And I think it can be done for good moral reasons internal to that doctrine. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, your soy boy comment is interesting because I think that's a lot of reasons why people peel away from liberalism, that they see it as weak, as like a pussy, or like something like that. And I'm not just Andrew Tating here. Two bald guys Andrew Tating together is a look no one wants, but yet here we are. So here's something I need to be very, very clear on. It's very important to me. I don't think liberalism is awesome at everything. In all conceptions of the good life, have certain values that they elevate and put at their core and marginalize other values that are not at their core. No single conception of the good life will manage to capture all human excellences. I think it's fantasy to think that's true, and we don't see the pros and cons then of the ways of life that are on the table. So something like Christianity, I think, has great goods of life at the heart of it. Things like fellowship, charity, love, devotion, piety. Those, I think, are undeniable human excellences, and we need to recognize that. But Christianity sucks at a lot of stuff. I don't want to list them because it's not my thing. But I think liberalism has a lot of awesome stuff at its core. I think like reciprocity, tolerance, freedom, irony, perspectivism, playfulness, cheer. Like in my book, I have this super clickbaity title we can come to, 17 Reasons to be Liberal. And I just kind of like go full court press on trying to give reasons why liberalism rocks. And I stand by that. But I also stand by the idea that is a bundle of virtues that is going to crowd out some awesome stuff, and that liberalism won't make room for those. So I think that certain genuine human goods really don't flourish well in liberal soil. And those are the kind of the people who soy boy liberalism. Those are the kind of virtues I think they're talking about. Things like bravery, courage, self-sacrifice, but also some religious stuff, devotion, piety, nature stuff too, non-instrumental concern for nature, oneness with nature. All those things I think are things that liberalism can be criticized for not prioritizing and not fulfilling. And if you in your deepest of hearts think that, if you're like a Homeric or something like that, like if you really think that bravery and courage are at the root of what it means to live well, liberalism is not going to do it for you. And you're going to have to, and then you will look with some justice, like Nietzsche did, like Andrew Tate in his idiotic way does. You would indict it as a deficient way of life because it lacks manliness. I'm not saying they're just different ideals of manliness, obviously. Yeah, okay, but you get it, right? And so when they turn away from that, I think that they're on the one hand, they're straw manning, which drives me nuts. But on the other hand, I think that if it can be made into a legitimate value-based rejection as to a way of life that they've considered and rejected because it doesn't click with what they see the highest excellences of human potential to be. That's that's why my book. Last thing. That's why my book is. That's why my book is preaching to a choir that doesn't know it's a choir. I'm saying, look, if this is who you are, if you like freedom, responsibility, all that stuff, then that tells you something about yourself. And here's a tradition that can really deepen your commitment to the things that you already have. But again, if you're in a chain, I got nothing to say to you. Not because I think you're unreasonable, but just because no one book is going to turn in a chain. They got their own thing going on.
I guess the on the last bit of it is all of those other things that liberalism isn't, as you're kind of the piety and tradition and bravery and courage and all these things. That doesn't necessarily equate to conservatism, right? I think some people might hear it as that. It's like, oh yeah, well that means you must be conservatism.
Yeah.
You want to, but is it possible to have both? Like, can you take elements from liberalism and elements, these other elements that maybe aren't liberal, but they might be in some other category? I don't think it's a kind of either or, these kind of discrete categories. I think you could have elements of it, yeah?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I just think that liberals can go, any concept of the good, but liberals can go a bit buffet style. So they load up their plate with their liberal foods, and then they go to like the dessert table and add a few things. And that's cool. But I just don't think you can add the roast beef from liberalism with the parm chicken from Christianity, with the whatever the hell from Hinduism. You can't just load up all those things on like the everything bagel, because those things are going to crowd each other out, and it's just not going to work. So that's why I think, in a certain sense, a choice and commitment has to be made. But I think that liberalism, so one of the things, I have two lines of answer here. One things that liberalism, I think, is very, very bad at, and I think is very, very dangerous for us, is self-sacrifice, in particular with respect to climate change. So I think liberalism is very bad at collective action problems, in the sense that, like, let's say you insist on your vacation to Hawaii. Fuck it, I'm going to go to Hawaii too. And it's going to create all these individual decisions of people running their own calculation according to a logic of entitlement and equality, and nothing's going to get fixed. So I think that when I think of a problem like climate change, I think liberal democracies are the problem, not the solution. I don't see the solution as going beyond that, but I see them as much a contributing factor to the mess that we're in as capitalism, just because it gears people to consider themselves and their entitlements in a certain way that they're very reluctant to relinquish. So in that sense, then, I think liberalism has a whole lot to take from other traditions, particularly around self-sacrifice, in a way in which, if we're going to navigate out of this, we got to try. We cannot just go full liberalism on this. So that's the one thing. But on the other hand, I do find, like I've been saying, that these value systems are incommensurable. So if I can make a pitch for my next book, which will be ready in like 15 years, it's going to be so big. I don't know, and so I'll see you then. But I want to call it Politics and Soulcraft. And what I want to do with that book is I want to work with insiders of illiberal regimes, so non-liberal regimes and often illiberal regimes. And I want to work with them to try to figure out what their regime, what they think the package of human excellences and goods that their regime promotes are, and how their state actively promotes it. Because liberal states are cute about, let 1,000 flowers bloom, let's not get our hands in it. The Chinese state's like, fuck that. We have a vision of what the good and flourishing life is for Chinese people, and we're going to pursue that aggressively. They call it like a new paradigm for civilization right now with Xi Jinping. You get Modi, and you get a certain vision of what Hindu nationalist democracy looks like. Like, they're not messing around. They have no reticence about using the state to promote that. And I think that each of those different states have a different value package, with some crossover, of course, but they're going to have like characters, like a Putinist has his own thing going on, a MAGA American has his own thing going on, an Islamic theocrat has their own thing going on as well, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I want to do in my next book is work with like true believers of various regimes that aren't shills, but that do commit to them and think that they're awesome, and try to get this menu going of all the different ways of life that are on the table right now, as supported by the most powerful institutions in the world.
Yeah, that's a fabulous idea. That's a
It's a fab
fantastic
project.
one.
So I just don't have the I don't. Not only do I don't speak Chinese. I don't have the competence in it, but I don't believe in it either. I mean, I'm a liberal, and so I need to find other Alexes that are kind of like that dig their thing, but are recognized that it's not like the only thing.
Hmm. Yeah,
Anyways,
I mean,
I won't talk about that more. But that's very much on the later base, and it's a very big project.
yeah. I would just say I think that each country has different ways of doing things, and I just has this an open question for me. I think we like to think that a representative democracy is what every country on the world should do, and I just don't think that's true.
Oh, that's really
And I don't know. I don't. The question I have is about all this, just as an open question, is how do you govern politically, maybe morally, ethically, societally, culturally, 1.4 billion people. I don't think that's a democracy. I don't know how to do that. I don't know. I don't have an answer. But I think that's a really interesting question. And so when I hear, oh, they're doing it this way, you could criticize it. Maybe there's obviously some cons to it, but there's a reason why they're going full court press on this way of doing things. And this is very interesting.
Yeah.
I want to ask about some of the other aspects towards the latter part of the book that are these is sort of your way of like a liberal way of life of these what you call spiritual exercises, right? So you talk about their voluntary, personal, their practice, their transformative. There's some connection with Stoicism there. So yeah, tell us about how you kind of uh, formulated or shaped these things and calling them kind of these spiritual exercises for trying to actually do or have the pragmatics of doing liberalism.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. Good. Thank you. That's an important part of my book, so I'm happy to talk about it.
Hmm.
So if Rawls is the Batman in my book, I got a Robin. Too. He doesn't wear the tights, but I got a Robin. And my Robin is a French philosopher and historian whose name is Pierre Hadot, Hadot. And you see all these books as a way of life these days. I'm obviously part of that genre, but he was the OG of that genre, where he started to write about philosophy as a way of life. And in particular, that guy is a classicist, specialist in ancient Greek, but really Roman philosophy. Anyways, so he came up with he really promoted this idea that back when philosophy was created in antiquity, okay, let me put it this way. Today we think of philosophy as this very abstract intellectual pursuit about like how to know the world, how to know knowledge, like some fundamental theoretical questions that we respond to with these gigantic theoretical systems, which is fine. But when philosophy was created back in the ancient world, philosophy wasn't about that at all. Philosophy meant a commitment to live a certain way, one committed to wisdom, loving wisdom, that's the etymology of the word, of course, and philosophical discourse was to try to bring people to a certain way of living. That was the idea. So you did philosophy not to know the world in a sense. You did you did philosophy in order to make yourself better, and knowing the world adequately was one key way in which that needed to happen. And so ancient philosophy put the good life first. That's the short version. And then ancient philosophy also generated all of these practices or techniques that Adil calls spiritual exercises, by which he means just repetitive daily practices that you and I can take up kind of any time in the day when we have a quiet moment to try to remind ourselves of our main commitments, try to shape ourselves in light of them, and just become better, happier, more philosophical people. So I don't know. Let's say you wake up one fine day and you're a Stoic emperor. I mean, okay, let's say you're Marcus Aurelius, so the emperor who was a Stoic. Every morning, that guy's particular problem in his own person was that he had a temper, and he would just fly off the handle at any number of the stupid ass petitions he would receive every day. Apparently, he would just kind of like go into rages, and he knew this about himself, and he knew this was a foible, and he's like, okay, I got to get this under control. And so every morning he would write a diary in which he would anticipate all the useless, stupid petitioners that would come to him, and he would try to anticipate their requests so that when he was actually confronted with them, he could keep his chill, and so he wouldn't lose it. So anyway, so you had all of these, so that's just one silly example, but you had all of these kind of daily practices, so diary keeping, meditation, dialogue with a friend, all of these were meant to be formative practices that would shape the self. Now, so ancient philosophy did that, but of course, religion is the big thing that does that for most people. So you have spiritual exercises, the best known in something like Catholicism would of course be things like prayer or confession, and these are meant not to, they're all techniques very clearly of self-formation. That's why you do them, to become a different kind of person, to become more grateful, more open to God's love, and more cognizant of your failures, whatever it may be. Anyways, so I think liberalism is as serious and as storied a moral doctrine as any of these churches. I mean, I really do think it can go toe-to-toe with religions, with ancient philosophies for moral depth and spiritual sophistication and all that stuff. But I think it needs to, it's missing a kind of ingredient, which is these practical techniques that would-be liberals like you and like me and maybe you could take on here and now to try to get ourselves, to make ourselves the best liberal we could be, to use an old army maxim. But, the idea is to really live up to them. And so in the book, I try to, so what I do, and this is a little bit clever, but I think it's also useful, is I try to read some of Rawls's most important concepts, the ones he's really famous for, the ones he almost has a brand name for, as spiritual exercises, as that ideas that he developed in order for individuals, for his readers, to be able to shape themselves in a certain way. So I went a little bit kind of highbrow with Rawlsian spiritual exercises. I can talk about at least one of them. But my sense is that these sorts of day-to-day practices have to be embedded throughout culture and throughout a tradition for individuals to be able to shape themselves according to the seriousness of the demands made on them.
So you have these three kind of categories or headings of sorts of the spiritual exercises. You have the original position, reflective equilibrium, and public reason. So maybe just kind of give us a kind of the overview of these three, like how they break down, how they work, and you can talk about the specific reasons of the 17 that you list out if you want on each of them, and then we can talk about dialogue and public conversation, all that.
That sounds good. Okay, so let me just take a step back, though. I just need to frame it very briefly and then go to these things. Okay, so liberalism, as we've been saying, means a lot of things to a lot of people. So in my book, I try to drill down more as to what, in my vision, being a consistent liberal would look like. And I say that it has, at root, being liberal has kind of three big top-line commitments. One is to freedom, personal freedom. One is to fairness, and the third is to reciprocity. And the pitch I make in my book is that to be a genuine liberal, you have to live up to these values in important respects. But that comes up to a really kind of like very direct, immediate question, which is a reader saying, why? Why? Because there's manifest advantages from not living up to those virtues. Like, let's say I make okay money as a professor, not great money. We're not going to get into this. But I make.
How's the university treating you down there in Sydney? Is it how they treat you?
It's great. So if you ask me, like having more money and paying lower taxes for me is like a manifest good. I'm not going to argue that it's not. Like it's nice to have more money. And so in some sense, my desire to have more money and the kind of freedoms that come with that will hit up against my desire for fairness and more redistribution, et cetera, et cetera. Or I do something very illiberal in my life. I think it's the most illiberal thing. Since we're friends, I can just confess. But I send my kid to private school. In Australia, that's not that outrageous. I know, it takes your breath away. Kind of 50% of people do it here, but I think that there's real kind of manifest advantages of, I know it sounds like I was going to say I've shot a puppy in the head like you're North Dakota or whatever, South Dakota lady. I haven't done that.
You send them to private school.
Yeah.
You monster.
I know. Yeah, but I cannot square that. Listen, she gets all kinds of benefits from, I think, a better education, reputational excellence, but I just can't square that with my commitment to fairness. Anyway, so there's ways in which we slip all the time and we don't honor. So then I have to make a pitch to my reader, and it's a very hard-nosed pitch. It's like, why be liberal? Like, what are the advantages? Like, it's nice to live in a just society, but fuck it, couldn't we just free ride? Like, couldn't we just kind of coast and just like, you pay your taxes, I'm good, I'll chisel away on my side. And that's a kind of solution, I guess, because we get the cream, but we don't have to do the work. We get to live in a just society, but so that kind of attitude, I think, is just very human and is very ordinary. And unless my reader is a saint, they're going to feel that. So then I need to be able to come up to them with reasons to be liberal beyond the niceness of living in a just, free, fair society. I need to give them personal benefits or rewards that come from adhering or cleaving to their liberal values, despite the many temptations not to. And this is where I come to my list of 17 benefits. That's just me as a salesman for liberalism. I'm trying to say, if you live up to your those 3 liberal commitments, freedom, fairness, and reciprocity, then there's all kinds of felicities, joys and pleasures of character, dispositions, emotions that you get to tap or access if you do actually toe the line and live up to those commitments. So those are the 17 benefits. They're the reasons why, they're the perks. I call them it's kind of tacky, but fine. I call them the existential perks of being liberal. Like, what's the good stuff about this way of life? And my pitch to the reader is that if you don't, what's the harm of not living? What's the harm of chiseling on your taxes or doing any of the many illiberal things? The pointy end is that if you do those kinds of things, then you won't access the very goods that a liberal way of life is designed to produce. You will have blocked yourself access from those 17 things that are awesome. The reader must be on the edge of their seat saying, Alex, what are these 17 things? Email them right away. So I'll read them. I know this is not a good format, but it gives you the vibe, and I'm happy to go into them. But in no particular order, they're just the developmental order. So these are the 17 kind of graces of character of being liberal. 1, impartiality. 2, autonomy. 3, anti-snobbery. I could come back to that because when people think of liberals, they think snob, and I think that's not inaccurate, but I want to say why it can be anti-snob. 4, playfulness. 5, stalwartness. 6, a feeling of being at home in society. 7, gratitude. 8, self-coherence. 9, avoidance of hypocrisy. 10, humility. 11, unity of the self. 12, gracefulness. 13, delight in others. 14, tolerance. 15, civility. 16, cheer. 17, redemption. Now, each of those has a backstory where I try to show how what that actually means and how it might be a fruit of a liberal way of life. And that's a kind of a big story we could tell. You have to go one by one, so I can't cover them all because they're all like different facets. But anyway, so now here's where that was my long, slow on-ramp to the real point, which was spiritual exercises. So the spiritual exercises are these ideas that I take from Rawls that are kind of mainstays of his philosophy that could be practiced by you and I today, here and now, if we so wish, in which to try to redouble or renew or clarify our own moral commitments to these liberal ideals and thereby produce the 17 excellences or existential perks that I list. So that's the idea. Does that picture?
I was going to say, yeah, it does. Maybe it might work here, might not. But in the book, you talk about Leslie Knope from Parks and Rec. I do. Not everyone has seen that show, but I think a lot of people have, at least when it was on. Maybe you can use her as a kind of case example of sorts of how, because I think she does most of these.
I'd have to do that on the fly. That's all. So Leslie Knope is the protagonist of a show called Parks and Recreation. And I think she is the goat of liberalism, the greatest of all time. I think she really embodies the sense of kind of the can-do, cheer, optimism, moral seriousness, but also being kind of fun, light, and attractive. Like it's just a great liberal, a free and generous person. That's her. And I think the show really fleshes that out as a kind of moral hero of the kind that, like, I think is. Readers are going to blanch or listeners are going to blanch if I say this. I think Leslie Knope is as serious as Achilles is for Homer, or as serious as the saints and martyrs are for Christianity. She is really a character ideal of what a liberal way of life could be. Anyways, your listener can switch off if they like, but that's something I try to make vivid because I think liberals need heroes, and every tradition needs heroes. And I just try to draw some that are there for us and that might be widely recognized. Anyways. So this different spiritual exercises are designed to produce Leslie Knope, or those kind of qualities. That's you led me there, but I'm okay to kind of sit there for a sec. We can do one very briefly. I won't do the other. We can talk about dialogue. I won't do the other two because it just gets kind of a bit long. But the first one is sort of the most immediately attractive, immediately clear one. And it's the most, if you've heard of Rawls, if you've read of Rawls, it's the most famous idea in his whole work, which I think is intended by him as a spiritual exercise. But if I may be so bold, I don't think anyone has really recognized that like I have. But the idea, okay, so original position, it's a meditative practice. He calls it a thought experiment, but it's like a reflective practice that you and I can do right now if we so wish. And so it's a series of steps that he lays out. And so step one is the setup, where he says, okay, imagine a group of people, let's say 10 people, just for visual clarity. And you 10 people are, I'm being a bit fast and loose, but you 10 people are a country. And you 10 people are all kind of meeting at a round table, and you have to decide upon the fundamental principles that will divide the costs and benefits of social cooperation of your society. So you have to decide the top line principles that will say who gets what in some fundamental sense of all the stuff that results from social cooperation. So things like wealth and resources, but also things like rights, the basis of self-respect, all that stuff, we have to carve it up. We have to determine who gets what, and we're going to try to propose principles that do that. That's the setup. So it's if you're listening and you're a political philosopher, this is a social contract sort of thought experiment where we get around and try to cook up some principles. Okay, but then here's the next famous step that Rawls does. The next famous step is to, okay, you're around this table. Now, here's the twist. You put on something that he calls the veil of ignorance, which is this idea that you pretend, or you try to entertain the idea that you don't know anything about those other people, and you don't know anything about yourself either. So you don't know that your gender, your sex, your class, your race, your physical ability or disability. You don't even know your conception of the good life, whether you're Christian, Muslim, or whatever. You are just kind of like this kind of, like in your mind, if you do this visualization, picture yourself as a kind of stick man, but without the man bit, like a stick person, if that makes sense. And so here's the game then. Then that person is going to have to try, along with those other stick men, stick people, you're going to have to try to figure out the top level principles, moral and political principles of your society, to distribute stuff without knowing your social positionality. That's the trick. So you have to design principles for a society in which you don't know where you will be placed. And the principle, to cut a long story short, what Rawls says is, sometimes he's not consistent. Sometimes he says people have to work it out on their own. So other times he gives you a menu. He's like, here are the main historical contenders for the theory of justice that should regulate your society. So you got things like perfectionism, certain kinds of theology, utilitarianism, and then he has his own principles, which are liberal. He calls it justice as fairness. We don't have to go into it. But his basic idea is that given that setup of the original position, and you don't know, I have no clue who we are, the principles of justice that we're going to favor are going to be strongly egalitarian. Why? In large part because of prudence. Because if you decide upon rules that advantage certain people over others, but you don't know where you are in that distributional order, you could be well and truly fucked when you open your eyes and recognize that, oh shit, I'm in a religion that's a persecuted minority, or oh no, I'm disabled, or oh no, whatever. So that's the thought experiment in which we try to generate principles of justice. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So then the question is, why do we do this? And it's a very, very interesting question that I don't think enough Rawlsians delve into. Because from a certain self-interested perspective, it's nuts to do that. Actually, like you and I are white dudes. We're middle class. I've just disclosed that I'm a fabulous rich professor, which isn't true, but let's go with it. Like, why the fuck would I ever entertain the possibility of trying to come up with principles of justice for my society while bracketing knowledge of my positional advantage? My positional advantage rocks. I am getting more than my fair share of the advantage of social cooperations. Why would I mess with the program? And so Rawls then has to have a very compelling answer. And his answer is something it's like a very hard moral punch. He's like, because you don't believe, because you're better than that, and you want to be better than that. And so he wants us to be able to reflect on questions of fundamental justice by agreeing to step outside of our positionality, by willing to consider ourselves as not neutral, but as not pushed by the kind of narrow interest that we may have as a white guy, as whatever constellation of stuff that we are right now. And this is really interesting and important for Rawls. Today, especially in certain strands of kind of, let's say, progressive liberalism, you have a notion of what it means to be an individual that is all about positionality and all about intersectionality. So you kind of start by listing off the intersections of everything you are, and that kind of accounts in some important way for who you are and how you roll. And that's not true, but Rawls would look at that in a sense as like, Yeah, okay. But everything that you've just listed, I'm a white, cis, whatever, all of that stuff are by and large accidents. They're just
Right.
contingencies of how you happen to be
Mhm.
born. So when you look at it from a certain angle, the most personal stuff about yourself is the most accidental, contingent stuff of all. And to truly recover your individuality, in the sense of truly being able to recover your faculty to self-determine and not just be pushed by wanting to support my whiteness or driven by wanting to support my cisness, to step behind all that stuff that isn't me, that's just a mess of shit that happens to be me. That's what the original position is trying to do. This sounds big and theological, and it is. He's trying to recover the fact of human freedom by having individuals step outside their seemingly deepest attributes and recognizing them as the accidents that they are. So that's the idea, that we want to choose principles of justice by being determined not by shitty factors that we would say are improper, but by truly moral factors that we can own up to and claim as individuals. And so that's the idea. So the original position is, in a sense, is a nothing exercise. You do it on your couch. You do it at home in the quiet moments. We're not actually convening anyone. There's no town square. In fact, it wouldn't even make sense to do it interpersonally because we're all picturing ourselves as sick people. Like, what do sick people talk about? They have no basis on which to negotiate or bargain. It's a dead-end conversation. But the idea, of course, is for you in the comfort of your couch is to remind yourself of some fundamental moral commitments that you have to notions of fairness and equity and reciprocity, and to revive those things, reanimate them in your heart and rekindle them such that when you go out into the world, you don't argue for the latest tax break. You don't insist. Like, here's the COVID era generated a meme for the kind of person Rawls loathes the most. And I talk about it a bit in my book. And it's a meme that's fraught with sexism and probably racism too. But it's the Karen. And even if the Karen is a problematic meme, the Karen gets at something I think that we acknowledge as like accurate in some measure. Like it does pick out something. And the Karen, who is a Karen, it doesn't have, it's usually a woman. It doesn't have to be a woman, right? Elon Musk was called the Space Karen, which I think is a sick burn. I
That
like
is a
that
burn.
burn.
I think
Anyways, but it's just people who
there is a
are,
male name for it's like the male counterpart for a Karen. I don't know what the name is though. I've heard it used
is
sometimes.
it Chad? I say Chad, but then my daughter's like, that's
That's
something
something
else.
else. I can't remember, but there is someone has created it, but it doesn't stick as much as
Okay.
the Karen thing does.
Right. Yeah, I get it. The male Karen, whatever. Doesn't your chromosomes don't matter to Karen. But the idea is that, so the Karen is someone who is absolutely unwilling, even for the smallest stake situation, to step behind the veil of ignorance. They are always insisting on their positionality, on their priority, trying to jump ahead in line, trying to speak to your manager to chisel out some sort of advantage. Someone who basically really repudiates fairness at a deep quotidian level. They may profess it publicly, but when rubber hits the road, they're going to just run game all the time, trying to get an edge. And so the original position is trying to, and an inner Karen is hard to put down. That lurks in all of us. I mean, it's a real temptation, especially in a culture of individualism and equality, where we all think that we're special and count and can cut. Anyways, and so we all have that temptation. And the original position is one of Rawls's strategy, one of the main ones, by which he's trying to get us to unlearn that sort of disposition or way of being in the world. And one of the main reasons is because being a Karen is just fucking depressing, man. It's just like you're just like
And
it's
exhausting.
and exhausting. Yeah, it's just not something you want to be. I mean, yeah. So there's kind of certain reasons why the Karen is socially corrosive, and you don't want a majority of Karens in a society. But the real pitch that Rawls and I make is that you don't want to be Karen for intrinsic reasons, because it's just not. You're going to be irritated, frustrated, whatever, all the time. So anyway, so the idea that I try to work up in the book is I'm trying to pluck from Rawls those moments in which he has these ideas that seem like really high-level philosophical ideas, but are really kind of techniques that individuals can work on themselves. As simple and as fundamental as, let's say, prayer is for a Christian, that you can do. And it sounds artificial to say, oh, let's do original position, but I don't know. I kind of... You can microdose it. You can kind of do it on the fly and quietly. Like if you're in the line at the grocery store at one of those awful self-checkout things, you're like, this is horseshit. And you just kind of realize you can look up and say, look, all these people are dealing with the same. I'm no better. And in a sense, that kind of like, it just lets some steam out of your anger and stuff like that. So some of these have really wild names. And I wrote this joke into the book, but one of them I call reflective equilibrium. And my daughter did a cruel trick on me one day. We're about to go surfing. She did something Sydney
Something you
Perks.
do in Australia.
And
Right.
How are you doing, Australia? Yeah, and we were just about out the door, and she's like, "Daddy, Daddy, I don't want to go." I'm like, "What? Why?" He loves surfing, and she's, "Daddy, I'd really just love to stay home and do reflective equilibrium with you." She was like, "You asshole." It was great. My wife put it was she was like 11 at the time. My wife put her up to it. It was funny. And so some of these sound really turgid, like hard, but I don't think they are. And so readers would be invited to check out the book. So the original position, so I chop up the perks of being liberal according to these three exercises, and each of them kind of gathers together some that belong together. So original position is really about recovering impartiality and not being a Karen, let's say. The reflective equilibrium stuff is around self-coherence and trying to regain a certain unification of the self. And the third one around public reason, which I'm happy to talk about a little bit, is around this idea of being happier, being cheerful, being public friendliness and civility in a robust way, and of learning to talk to other people, especially those that disagree with you, in ways that don't immediately get your back up and you become combative. So to be tolerant is often kind of a word that kind of sticks in your mouth in a bad way, but to become tolerant in the right way, like a certain lightness of it.
Yeah. So yeah, let's end on that. Obviously, for me personally, I love dialogue, especially when they converge. So that's very very important. So I think it's important to understand how can you learn or how can you be better, to engage with people in conversation, in dialogue, constructive conversations, especially with people that disagree with you. I mean, you could take any hot button issue at any point, uh, race relations in 2020, vaccine compliance or not in 21, 22, gender issues that have been ongoing for the past couple of years, various, conflicts around the world. And, people feel extremely passionate, extreme strong feelings about on one side or the other. And I'm not saying people should go around and they should just, start telling people like, so tell me what you think about Israel and Palestine, or tell me what you think about people that, identify as non-binary, or tell me what you think about, African Americans, United States. But I think if these conversations come up, or if these things are a part of your, world, if you will, I think if you have, let's say, on one side, you feel strongly on one side of something, let's say, I think it's important. This is something I tell my liberal friends. It's like, why is it hard for you, people that claim they're liberals? Why is it hard to listen to the person that, is maybe MAGA and wears the red hat and voted for Trump and all these things? It's just some people just can't even have that conversation, or the conversation they have is going to be to some kind of, conversion experience. I'm going to proselytize and convince and debate and all that. And it doesn't always have to be that way. So how do we foster a kind of a constructive dialogue where you're curious, you're open, you're trying to hear different positions? How can we, or I should say, how is doing liberalism, or liberalism as a way of life, help us to kind of do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Very complicated question. If we could solve it, then we could solve some stuff. I'll start with 1 minute. I'll start with a bit of an oblique approach, and then I'll go right to public reason, or to this idea of how we talk to each other. So something that people nowadays have this idea that liberals are like really like suckers. Like we're like naive, do-gooding, tax and spend, kind of like what's that guy's name? The neocon. A neocon is a liberal who's been mugged by reality. Crystal. That idea, right? That like they've been to the school of life. Okay, that's fine. So, but something that's very interesting about early liberals in particular, and I talk about this in my book, is that they were total pessimists. Early liberals had a keen awareness that people suck in a really deep sense, and that they can't be trusted. And so one of my desert island books, the one I just absolutely love and I kind of recommend to students, is Judith Shklar. She was political theorist at Harvard University, and she wrote a bunch of books, but the one I love a lot is called Ordinary Vices. It's great literary book, great idea book, anyways. And at the root of that book, she says that liberalism is animated, interestingly, by misanthropy, and in the sense that, like, it has a deep suspicion of human beings and wants to keep each other apart. And then what liberals did at that point is they rolled up their sleeves. So misanthropy can lead to nihilism, no problem, right? Like, you could be like how some people read Nietzsche, like, fuck it, let's burn it to the ground. We got to start over. Or how, like, Hamlet says to Ophelia, like, human beings should stop reproducing. Like, we should extinct ourselves. So you can go dark, misanthropy can go dark really quick. But the early liberals were like, they were Leslie Nopes, right? The idea was that people suck, but that's not paralyzing. You roll up your sleeve and find some solutions. And so their solutions were things like constitutionalism, where power couldn't be consolidated in one source of a person you couldn't trust. So anyways, long version short, whatever that expression is, the idea that this is a long on-ramp to this question, I'm sorry, but the idea that I'm trying to get at is liberals should be very aware that we can do things in bad faith. Liberals often think of other people in bad faith, and liberals. So when a liberal looks at a Christian and sees a Christian professing love, they're like, what really motivates you is weaponized love. You're not. This isn't love. This is in-clan nonsense. And I think that liberals should take a hard look at themselves when they look at their own doctrine of tolerance, and to see that they weaponize it in a very analogous way to the way bad liberals will do to tolerance what bad Christians do to love. And this goes back to here I'm tying it together, but the idea here is that people suck. We just reinvent new hit singles to suck at, new bangers by which we're bad. So that's the idea. And so, so that's the kind of picture. So I think that liberals can really listen and talk in bad faith to others. But at the heart of liberalism is this idea of public reason. Public reason is, in a liberal polity that is plural, it's a big word to say something pretty self-evident. In a plural polity, we accept that political decisions, let's say legal decisions, can't be based on controversial conceptions of the good life. So if, let's say, a liberal state, or if a state wants to pursue, let's say, a generous policy towards the least advantaged group, it can't go full Christian and say, we're doing that because they are the closest to God and because, et cetera, et cetera. You can't give reasons out of your conception of the good or comprehensive doctrine that will exclude other people from policy decisions that you should have a stake in because you live in a democracy and public power is shared. Does that make sense? Or is it a bit complicated? Yeah, okay. So what liberals had to do then, or what people had, this is not liberals, but thinkers after the war of religion, so people like Locke, people like Voltaire, and then it builds up steam, is you had to find a kind of a discourse or a register of language by which human beings could communicate with one another and mutually justify themselves to one another on issues of fundamental justice that wouldn't draw from reasons unique to their conception of the good life and hence be unjustifiable to the other. And so you need to come up with this, neutral's the wrong word, it's badly the wrong word, but it's close enough. You need to find this like neutral lingua franca that by which we can justify political and legal decisions to one another, even though we have equal moral and political status. That's the idea. So liberals came up with this idea of public reasons, which is that, look, we're all members, in your case, of the United States. That means that we are all under this umbrella, let's say, of the Constitution. So let's say then that when we argue for a particular immigration policy, a particular tax policy, or whatever, your reasons that you draw from are from that repository of reasons, because that's something we all share. So we talk about prosperity, freedom, the fruits of whatever the life, liberty, equality, all that sort of language, because a Christian can share that as much as a Muslim can, as much as God help them, and a chain can, God, et cetera, right? We can all vibe on that level. And so liberals then, so that's that kind of, but liberals are in a tricky position, right? Because the Christians, just take the Christians are all bilingual in the sense that they have public reason, they know that they're conversant with the political language, but they also have their own value system going on that is perhaps more fundamental to them. Liberals don't have that in the bag because we're liberals all the way down. All we have is this public reason sort of stuff that we start to apply to all areas of life, be that friendship, dating, whatever. And so then when liberals start to hear, this is when liberals can turn nasty and I think vicious. And I'm going to be a bit simplistic here, but I think you'll get the spirit. But when liberals hear reasons or motivations for political decisions that don't click immediately in their public reason register, then they think immediately that those people are acting out of the worst possible faith, or they're trying to impose their worldview pronto on other people. Sometimes that may be the true, but most often I suspect it's not the case. And so what I try to do in my book is that liberals are already really, really fluent and conversant in speaking public reason. It's our mother's milk. We know exactly how to deploy those language. What we're really shitty at is being able to listen to other people in the spirit of those concepts, even if they're not using them explicitly. So I tried to get the kind of like an internal decoder in the head of liberals to try to hear other people out in the most charitable, generous way they can, in order to try to engage with them. They may disagree, but at least they see their position comes from a place of goodness. And it's a really old theological problem. It's too long.
So I guess the piece here is that's very helpful, because I think it's giving a kind of backdrop or context of saying like why we want to engage with people about different ideas, or why we would do that, or why we would want to have some type of public reason or things like that. And I won't ask you about all the general questions about like, oh, the internet and social media, all these things. But um, I find that when you talk to people, IRL, in real in real life, right? Um, and doesn't matter really where they're from. Obviously, differences are really important. But I find this kind of goes to our point about like how conservatives and liberals, there's a certain overlap that starts to happen, right? But I really just find that at the bottom of it, you find the person, you find the human, and you find there's a lot of overlap there. And I guess with all of these things that liberalism has, how can they do that better? Like where they're not judgy or a little snobbish, or it has to be, you need to be part of my team, or you need to have this kind of, it's like a circular firing squad half the time, and well, you're not the purist of this, and you don't believe all the things or say the words.
Sure.
Yeah, how do we just kind of push past that and just kind of really have good dialogue with other people, that we can learn something and you can be curious about other people's opinions?
I don't know. I don't know if I have an answer to that. I mean, my answer to that is stop doing that. I mean, it's like stop being an asshole. Like I don't know what but I mean that in a deep sense, right? Like stop trying to pounce, stop trying to point score. Like just like freaking forbearance is not a virtue that's much hyped in a capitalist economy, but Jesus Christ, do we need it both collectively and individually?
And I find that it's a kind of like internal thing, right? Like it's when I've had conversations with people that are to the left of me, it's very much a kind of how it feels, at least for me, is, are you one of me or are you not? Which box am I putting you in, or am I not? It feels very confined. It feels very constrained. Or if I don't say the right words or say exactly what their beliefs are about fill in the blank, maybe I'm a libertarian, maybe I'm a conservative in sheep's clothing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Again, not that those things are bad or that those groups or people are bad, but for them,
you're being
it is. Yeah. It is a kind of like, yeah, if you vote Republican in the U.S., you might as well be a bigot. And again, not everybody thinks that way. Not all progressives or all liberals, very left liberals think that way. But in these periods where there's breakdown in conversation or communication, it does feel like it's a kind of, okay, are you saying the right things? Are you believing the right things? Are you on the team? Are you in the box? And if you're not, then you're not. And it feels like kind of black and white. So yes, people should stop doing that shit.
Yeah, they do our best. I mean, I just don't think those people are. I don't know how to put it. I don't like. So okay, cards on the table. I'm kind of progressive, but I'm kind of not. I'm progressive in terms, especially of economic redistribution. I'm kind of a liberal socialist-y kind of person. The book doesn't play that up that much, but that's where I sit. But in terms of kind of the culture stuff, more, I'm not a progressive. I wouldn't. I don't see myself there. I mean, I would. This is why I would say that I think progressives, to my mind, the kind that you're painting, kind of caricaturing, but I agree with the caricature. I know what you're talking about. I don't think those are liberals. I don't think if the meaning of liberal is free and generous, they're not hitting those marks. especially the generosity box with hermeneutic interpretive generosity. So in that sense, I would think that that's not, I mean, they're liberal in kind of like their positions, but they're not liberal in acts, not faith, not acts. I'm like an old Protestant chestnut, but you know what I'm saying. And so they're the kind of person. So I don't, in the book, I don't talk to the people far to the right of me, but I don't talk to people far to the left of me either. It's some different interlocutor that needs to discuss with them. But I guess my pitch to them would be that the last perks that I list, and these perks make people so mad. They're like, "Fuck you with your good news." That's something I hear all the time. But the last ones are all about like being like happy. Happy's a good word. Why not? Being cheerful. So there's like delight in others, tolerance, civility, cheer, that kind of thing. And I think that this is the pitch I'm making. If you want to be a box categorizer in the kind of that way, you're going to rule yourself out from all of those good affects. But then they'll come back at you and say, how could you be cheerful, happy, etc., in the face of the monstrous injustice in the world? And then we're kind of talking past each other, we're kind of seeing each other, but that's another kind of conversation. But if the pitch, I really don't believe that the world is, I put it this way, forget Rawls. I believe our world has utopic potentials in it. That is something I really strongly believe. I believe we don't live up to our liberalism all the time, but there are so many amazing things in our world that are fragile fruits of civilizational accomplishment that have been won through things like liberal democracy and that we take for granted, like friendship between the sexes, Wikipedia, not people not cutting in line, like a whole bunch. I could list a bunch of them. Men doing the dishes at home, none of that stuff is just like the human condition. All that stuff was really hard work, and we could do a whole lot better. But Rawls had this idea of our societies being realistic utopias, by which he meant they kind of suck, but you can see in them the potential for something much better according to their principles. We don't have to cancel it and move somewhere else. And this is where I'm not a progressive, because I do have a reasonable faith in the goodness of this world and its ability to allow everyone to flourish in it. So I'm an optimist. I mean, that's what the book is, and that's the sensibility of the book. It's who I am as a man. But if you don't vibe with that, then you're not going to vibe with the book. But I'm trying to show how that might be a not out there position. And it's tricky too, because I mean, I'm raised in tertiary institutions, right? We are left. So the kind of colleagues I'm talking about, no one can be openly right, I think. Well, no, that's too strong. But it's, I mean, the progressive bias of universities is a thing. Yeah. That's no doubt. Yeah. And so that's, I guess that's a bit more on my mind when I'm writing the book, but it's something I just have to navigate. So I'm well socialized in that sensibility. Sure. I know what it is.
Well, Alex, this was such a delight. Really, it's a real big joy. Your book is obviously wonderful, and I'm super happy for again how the conversation with you is very much how the book kind of reads too, in the sense of, not that it's too colloquial, but it is very thoughtful, but very tangible, and you can kind of grasp it, and your thoughts and your wisdom and your clarity on something we talk about all the time is just super invaluable. So I really am grateful for you coming on here.
Oh, that was I had a blast.
Absolutely,
Thank you.
Absolutely.